Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm honored that Melissa asked me to be part of the Colonial Revival quilt exhibit that she planned. I love coming to Nebraska. Anyone who loves textiles as much as I do knows that this is a great place to be. So thank you for turning out this afternoon. I am going to talk about a Colonial Revival and its influence on quilts. And Colonial Revival is something that we might think of as a movement. And when I teach the history of interior design, in order to manage big groups of material, in interiors we always talk about movements affecting design. And for the most part, those movements started in Europe, and then we looked at them and adopted them to our country. So if you started in the beginning of the 19th century, when Napoleon was still Emperor of France, we were involved in a neoclassical movement. And then during the early reign of Queen Victoria, we were involved in a romantic movement. And then after the Civil War, we adopted the British aesthetic movement, and that's the era when we had crazy quilts and Queen Anne houses, and eventually it turned into American clutter. And so by the end of the 19th century, Americans are ready for new movements. And all over both this country and in Europe, people were grappling with the dramatic changes that were taking place between the 19th and 20th century. They had to do with colonization, urbanization, industrialization movements that made tremendous changes in people's lives. So that lives that had gone on for like hundreds of years in very similar patterns were experiencing stress and change. And in the design area, people either embrace change, look toward the new, or they kind of look nostalgically back to the past trying to get an anchor. And so we had choices. And when we looked to Europe, the English had moved away from the aesthetic movement. It had gotten a little too overblown for them, and they had already started into what they called the arts and crafts movement. And that was their sort of new futuristic look. And in Europe, there was more of a dichotomy. There were people who graduated from the School of Beaux-Arts in Paris who really looked to the past, to the traditional classic past. And then there was the new thrust there of Art Nouveau and the Vienna Secession. And America always looked at all these ideas, and we could have chosen to follow, just like we did in the aesthetic movement, the arts and crafts Art Nouveau movement, embraced it totally, or we could have looked to the past, which is what we actually did. However, we're still influenced by those other things going on. So we're going to look to the past, to Colonial Revival. And then you're going to see mixed in a little bit of Art Nouveau and a little bit of arts and crafts. And then eventually, Americans always follow fashion because we're out there looking for the new as well as living in the past. And so by the time the late teens and 20s get here, another movement will take place, the Art Deco movement, and we will embrace that. All of this will be mixed in with our Colonial Revival. A movement is something that you can talk about after it's well established. When it first starts, it's just different things happening in different places, and then people kind of step back and look at it, and they see a common thread running through it, and then they can see it kind of growing, and then most movements taper off, something new comes along. So there are all these disparate threads which eventually look like they belong together, but they don't always link just perfectly. I'm going to give you just a few statistics before I turn off the light. By 1915, sort of as the Colonial Revival was peaking up that curve, Americans sent for over $18 million of antiques annually from abroad. Now remember, most people were living on less than $2,000 income a year. And annually, Americans are spending $18 million buying antiques to come over to their colonial homes. Because with only 13 colonies, there really wasn't enough furniture, antique furniture in America to go around. And even with all that, there wasn't enough to decorate all the homes in Colonial Revival style. So the furniture factories of Grand Rapids turned out tons of reproduction furniture. A lot of it is kind of, pseudo-colonial, and you'd be able to spot it. For years, people dumped on it, but now people collect it. However, an antiques expert estimated in the 1970s that 1/2 of the antiques in museums today claiming to be real colonial may actually be really good reproductions made in the first 3 decades of the 20th century by people who still had the skills to copy Chippendale chairs. So we're going to look today at that heavy colonial revival movement and what it did to quilts in the United States. So I'm going to get the lights. Okay, this is going to be a time when any design worth doing, as Ruby McKim labeled her catalog, had to be related in some way to colonial revival. So you have to have a pretty open mind because the quilts that are related to colonial revival don't all look the same. And you also have to be willing to know that in addition to the ancient colonial influence, there's going to be all these other movements that we're still in tune with that'll get mixed up with our colonial revival. Get my hand in place here. This is actually a beautiful pattern for an Art Nouveau carpet, a design from Paris. And if you look right up here, you'll probably see some of Marie Webster's Windblown Tulips, because she definitely knew what was happening in the Art Nouveau movement in Europe. And here is a ceramic porcelain container, also part of the French Art Nouveau movement. You can see these shapes that appeared in a lot of the simple textiles of the early 20th century. And these will be called colonial sometimes in this country. This is a chair made in Grand Rapids during this period. The bottom is slightly spindly like Eastlake furniture, and it was made into Art Nouveau by this curved top with the pressed oak Art Nouveau design. Today these are also highly collectible, but Americans didn't really embrace all the eel-winding furniture that he mentioned in the poem. This is Otto Wagner's building out of the Vienna Secession, and you can see these pale colors. This is the outside of a building. The floral arrangements, the curling vines, and I think you can see how that's probably going to influence a lot of the quilts that came out in the 1920s and 30s in this country. So that would be Art Nouveau influence on our quilts. And then there is the arts and crafts movement. By the time it came to this country with the work of the Roycrofters and Gustav Stickley and his brothers, we adopted one of the more simplified forms, but here is the Morris chair and the furniture with the square edges, and then you can see the very stylized arts and crafts decoration. And the more I teach about the arts and crafts movement and the Art Nouveau movement, they are actually very intertwined. We separate them for purposes of talking, but there's a lot of influence back and forth between those two movements. And this is a very good picture, a cover of Good Housekeeping, 1912. And here you see a woman in one of the new dresses from 1912, losing its long sleeves and its high neck and its really tight corseted waist. And she's draping a quilt over a bed. She's wearing what would be an arts and crafts influenced dress. And this textile right here of simple designs with geometric edges, this is an arts and crafts textile. And then the bed is a pseudo four-poster Colonial Revival. And on the floor is the little braided rug, which became a Colonial Revival icon. And Then there is the basket quilt, which is a design that they brought back from the mid-19th century. So you can see just by looking at one picture how complicated a colonial revival is. I'm having trouble hitting my. Eventually, Americans defined colonial revival as anything pre-crazy quilt era. So when they revived colonial, it didn't have to be from the days of the first colonies to 1876 when we had the Declaration of Independence, or 1787 when we signed the Constitution. We extended it because women wanted quilts to be part of the nation's interest in colonial revival. And if we had really gone back to the 18th century, we now know that not that many quilts were actually made in this country, and many of them were like whole cloth quilts, and they definitely wanted quilts in colonial revival. So by extending the definition, you just went beyond crazy quilts, and you were okay. It could be colonial. I'm going to put my flipper here. This is a portrait from Wayne County, Ohio, where I live, and this is a little lady at her spinning wheel. That became another icon of the colonial revival movement. This lady's painting was done in the 1840s, so you can see we've extended it clear into the 1840s for colonial revival. And I couldn't help but put this one in for you. Here's Her Majesty the Queen of England with the spinning wheel, which shows that the stress with the modern world was not limited to Americans. And she, as the head of one of the biggest nations in the world with colonies all over, was probably under plenty of stress. Now, as I told you, when a movement gets going, when people notice it, then they always wonder, when did it begin? Who started it? And it's always very hard to pin down a date. So now when we look back, Americans often look back to the time of the Civil War when they put on the great sanitary fairs, and there were no restaurants in those days, for the most part, in big cities to handle the big crowds. And so the ladies, to raise money, set up colonial-style kitchens. They picked a theme. And they liked the colonial theme because it reminded people dealing with the Civil War that their colonial foremothers had also gone through very hard times. They had to raise money for supplies, they had had to sacrifice, and that they could do the same thing. And in some of those colonial kitchens, as little pageants, they put on tableaux, little stage scenes where they reenacted colonial activities. And this is an engraving of one done at a sanitary commission at the New England Kitchen Quilting Party. So these ladies up near Boston had dressed up in colonial attire, which isn't quite colonial if you could date those costumes. They went back to their attic trunks, and they have things from the 1840s and the 1810s, and they put little hats on, and they're around the quilting frame. The one thing that the Civil War sanitary fairs did, though, they did get people thinking about antiques. And this is a photograph of the inside of one of the displays at a lot of the sanitary fairs. And it's a display of relics. And one of the ways they raise money is they ask people to donate their antique relics that often were associated, like George Washington's coat or something that people would be curious to see. And then that's the way they charge money to come in and see these antiques. And it did get certain people conscious of the fact that we needed to be keeping our antiques. And shortly after the Civil War, people got interested in establishing museums of antiquities. Then other people looked to the Centennial Exhibition of 1876 as a place when colonial revival may have started. And at the Centennial, they had a New England kitchen also. They weren't really celebrating the old kitchen. They were contrasting it with the new modern kitchen. And so again, it reminded people of where they had been, but the celebration emphasis was really on the new, not the old. And that makes it different from the bicentennial, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the old rather than worshiping the new machinery. It may have been more reasonable to look at the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition as one of the ones that made this new movement really take off. In Chicago, they built a huge site for the 1893 exhibition, and they hired architects McKim, Mead, and White to supervise the design, and they came up with the plan for this grand mall surrounded by white classical buildings. And several of the architects were graduates of the School of Beaux-Arts in France, which put its emphasis on going back to classical style. Millions of people came to see the Chicago exhibition, and they remembered this as the Great White City. Every building was classical except Louis Sullivan, the architect from Chicago, who had to be invited. He was really in the more arts and crafts, Art Nouveau style of design, and today a lot of people think of his as the prettiest building. But in 1893, it was the classical that reigned. After this, people went back to their hometowns, and the City Beautiful movement started, and they began to clean up and think about their classical courthouses and preserving them. People painted their houses white. If you had a great big old colored Queen Anne lady, you painted your house white and covered up all that beautiful gingerbread from the aesthetic era. And McKim, Mead, and White went back and began to build classical style homes for wealthy people who liked this style. And this is a McKim, Mead, and White house. You can see it's quite a mansion. It's built on the Georgian style, and then these people had plenty of wealth for wings out at each side. But this style of house will be highly copied all over the United States, and it's still being done today. Then tastemakers and writers began to write about cleaning out Victorian clutter and approaching a more classical style of decoration. And Edith Wharton, before she began to write her novels, teamed up with Ogden Codman and wrote a book called The Decoration of Houses in the late 1890s. This is Edith Wharton, and this is her home, built in sort of classical Italian Renaissance style. And this is the interior of her home. And I think you can see it doesn't look anything like the houses of the crazy quilt era. They've gone back to classical woodwork. She lightened the palette. You have pale yellow walls with white woodwork. The oriental rugs are back on the floor. And then the furniture is not quite 18th century. It's really more Empire. But they mixed back to anything that was pre-aesthetic. Now, when you did revivals, wealthy people did not have to pick classical revival. And I just want to show you a few of the other revivals that coexisted. This is Stan Hewitt Hall in Akron, one of the largest Tudor revival mansions in the United States. And it is done in English Tudor revival style. And this is important because Tudor revival will get mixed in with colonial revival. Here is an ad for Arrow shirts, and you can see the electric lights. We're in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then you can see this carved Tudor table with the cup and cover decoration, along with the soft, comfortable, easy chairs. In the Colonial Revival exhibition that Melissa did, you'll see a quilt that uses the crewel embroidery designs, a winding vine surrounding a vase of flowers. And those designs work well in Tudor Revival as well as Classical Revival settings. Oops, I went one too far. This is Elsa de Wolf, another writer and taste setter. And this is the way she looked in the 1890s in her cluttered Victorian house. And then she embraced change also. And this is the way she looked in the 19-teens when she ran a very successful decorating business. And this is the room that she did for the Colony Club in New York, a women's club. And you can see that she's taken 18th century furniture of Rococo style and she's lightened it by painting it white. And then she's combined it with lots of chintz and classical designs for an update, a classical update. Elsa de Wolf preferred French Revival rather than English. And there were wealthy people that liked French Provincial Revival or French Revival. This is the home that belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Harvey Firestone Jr. in Akron, and they liked the French taste and furnished their house in colonial French furniture. This is a room in the French taste that Elsa de Wolfe would have liked. The beds are swagged with testers that don't go clear across, but they're there. And you can see they've substituted a modern twin bed for the big, large bed. They've added a chamois at the end of the bed where you could recline on cushions. And the woodwork is very classical with paintings. And the chandelier, which most colonial revival chandeliers imitate little candles with silk lampshades. Elsa de Wolfe wanted you to set up your bedroom like in compartments. You went into a little boudoir sitting room, and then you had a dressing room, and then you had your bedroom. And American women who like to read about her writings were not really going to remodel their house in that fashion. So they liked this arrangement where you might add the little boudoir settee at the end of the bed, and they still intended to share this bedroom with their husband. It wasn't going to be a totally feminine retreat. Now I'll just show you, this is a Colonial Revival house in Worcester where I live. It's gotten a little crowded in this section, but this is a nice Colonial Revival house. It's very symmetrical. It has ionic columns. It has the pseudo green shutters that don't shut. And it has a Palladian window up here in the attic level. So these are some of the features of Colonial Revival houses. And this is another little one in Wayne County, the Dutch version. So they were like regional versions of Colonial Revival. Any of these houses could have been furnished with antiques. Most Americans had to mix things. They couldn't redo their whole house at once. This is when people began to buy colonial style furniture. This is a firm in New York on Madison Avenue, and you can see they deal in antiques, which they brought in from Europe, and reproductions, which were made in this country. Now, all of this was combined with modern technology. You weren't going to give up your vacuum cleaner, circa 1905. And you definitely, this is circa 1920s, wanted electrical wiring systems and plenty of room for your electric lights around your twin beds. And you definitely wanted a modern bathroom, so you put little antique legs on your modern tub. And this is the kind of advertising you'll see. There's a colonial doorway with a fan light, a plank floor, true colonial and all but cost. And there's the plank floor, and here's the wing chair, the comfortable chairs. The fireplace is not quite colonial, you'll notice. And over the fireplace is a woman in her flapper dress. So this is 1920. And here's another Arrow shirt ad, and you do see by 1920 the flapper and the elegant young man. And if you look at the wall, here's the candles of Colonial Revival. So you have to accept this merge of old and new as we look at Colonial Revival. Now, when Colonial Revival got started in the 1890s, people wanted to remember what Colonial Revival looked like because they'd kind of forgotten during the Crazy Quilt era. And so along the East Coast, a lot of people, villages, Litchfield, Connecticut, Sturbridge Village, they opened up houses that were still standing. I lived in Guilford, Connecticut at one time that had well over 100 houses built in the 18th century in town. So where you had a row of these that were often turned into places where you could come and see what a true colonial house looked like. And women dressed up in pseudo colonial costume. This is from the teens. She's in about a 1916 dress with an 1850 shawl, but she's dressed colonial. This is the interior of a bedroom from Deerfield, Massachusetts, and it appeared in Maria Webster's book written in the 19-teens, and it's showing you what a Colonial Revival bedroom looked like. And if you could have only one room colonial, the bedroom was the room of choice. And people talked about their colonial bedroom. And it would have some kind of a four-poster, ideally. It would have a quilt, even though it wouldn't have had that in the colonial times. It would have had a dust ruffle, which now could be made with plenty of ruffles rather than flat, because we weren't short of fabric. It probably had curtains on the window, which they rarely did in the 18th century bedrooms. And here then you see the little braided rug that becomes symbolic. And then you have to look at this chest and know that this is really empire style long after the colonial days. So this is the kind of bedroom you would have visited, and you would have probably wanted wallpaper on your wall because it's now the early 20th century. This came out of a decorating handbook to show you how you could buy furniture. And again, you're going to see the four-poster bed with a ruffle, and a quilt, and then curtains on the windows. And these are rag rugs, which you could substitute for braid. So this is kind of the idea that you were headed toward. And then as we go into the 20s, we'll see a little more lightening of this, a little more modern interpretation, but these are the colonial twin beds. And then the Art Deco curtains. People who wrote books, Alice Morris Earle was one of the earliest to write about home life in colonial days. And she did put a short few pages in about quilting, because she knew women were interested in having quilts as part of Colonial Revival. There are other books, and there's some out on display in the case, that talk about the quest for the colonial, the search for colonial, how to decorate your colonial home. And you can see in the quest for the colonial, here are a couple at an antique auction. These really aren't, again, colonial costumes. This more looks like 1850 with about an 1850 quilt, but this was going to be okay in your quest for the colonial. Aunt Jane of Kentucky by Eliza Calvert Hall, who also wrote the first Colonial Revival book devoted strictly to textiles, and that's the Handbook of Hand-Woven Coverlets, had a big influence on pushing Colonial Revival. She did a lot of publication in magazines about coverlets, and then also was asked to write on Colonial Revival quilts. And then, of course, Marie Webster with the first book devoted entirely to quilts, and later, these are two editions of her books. And then Ruth Finley's book came out in the late 20s. All of these are Colonial Revival literature. So people who wrote about architecture, who wrote about interiors, who wrote about textiles and quilts were all giving you information on what to do. And women knew that they wanted quilts to be part of Colonial Revival, and that was a strategy. They just intended that that's the way they would be. This is a float from Ohio, and they're reenacting in the early 20th century the good old days in the log cabin with the log cabin fireplace, and here's the woman in a rocking chair with a bed and a quilt, and another one hanging on the wall. So quilts became one of the important icons of Colonial Revival. And here's a little group scene up in Michigan of women putting on a colonial party. And here you see the spinning wheel and the yarn winder out, so it could also center on hand-woven coverlets. Now, all during the aesthetic period, not every woman in America wanted a crazy quilt. So there were women who quietly, by themselves, or in groups, kept up the old-fashioned kind of quilting. They made piece quilts and applique quilts. They did hand quilting. It wasn't the leading style, but they were there to instruct and to take up anew when Colonial Revival came around. In the farm magazines, during the aesthetic period, women began to send in patterns and search for patterns. They would write in, I would like a pattern by this name, can anyone provide one? This is from a scrapbook of a woman who's cut out designs. Right down here, if you look, is the cluttered interior, much in little space of the aesthetic movement. And these are pictures that she's cutting out of farm magazines. They're sharing patterns. And then eventually the ladies art company in St. Louis will collect patterns and begin to publish them in a national form. But it was being done in the 1880s and 90s through these farm networks. And eventually some women, just made a block of each pattern that they either saw in a paper or saw in somebody's house or at a fair. And this is an interesting picture of this woman who must have put all her blocks together in a sampler quilt. Now, when the Columbian World's Fair was over, in the leading taste magazines like the Ladies' Home Journal and Harper's Bazaar and the Delineator, women's magazines, people announced that a quilt revival was at hand. And they urged women to either make quilts or to go to their attic and get out their grandmother's quilts. And while they were there, they could also search for the old colonial hand-woven coverlets. And those two forms of bed coverings were considered really appropriate for a colonial revival home. This is an overshot star coverlet from Pennsylvania. You can see the little pine tree border here and stars, and this is a three-color quilt in the red, white, and blue. And if you were making quilts, red, white, and blue were recommended for true colonial quilts. This is actually an old quilt from the 1840s or 50s, a very complicated piece star, and here you can see the red, white, and blue. And now I'll show you some of the revival quilts. These were quilts that began to be made in the 1890s, using the themes of the red, white, and blue of the coverlet era of the mid-19th century. And here is a beautiful pieced red and white quilt that was on display in Ohio with the icon spinning wheel in front of it. This is a little tiny star. These are tiny little stars set in a 9-patch, double 9-patch, set on point and bordered from the county in which I live. But from your distance, doesn't it kind of look like a woven coverlet pattern? And it's done in red, white, and blues. And then here is an Irish chain in blue and white. These are quilts that would have been very much in touch with what they considered the best kind for colonial revival in the 1890s. And when you come up on it, it's not going to show up very well here, but there's a feather wreath design. And part of colonial revival was to revive the fine hand quilting. And companies came out with patterns. Feather wreaths were very common. And here is a little pine tree that you saw on the edge of the coverlet. This is the way they liked it during the colonial revival period. There's one in the gallery in blue and white, and this is in the red and white, two of the recommended color schemes. And again, you can see the feather wreath right here, and running feather vines in this part, and then just grid quilting across the tree. The pine tree had appeared on a lot of colonial flags on coins in the state of Massachusetts, so it was considered a colonial theme well worth reviving. They also revived applique quilts. And they had to go back to like the 1840s and 50s to find the best applique, and that's when they made the jacquard coverlets with all the floral designs. And this is from a DAR brochure. You can see how closely it's related to some of those earlier settings. So this is your good colonial revival room. This one has the 4-poster with the tester. The bed has a dust ruffle with ball fringe added, and then a revived applique quilt, along with a true 18th century piece, Chippendale chest, and a colonial mirror, and then your milk glass made into a lamp. And this is when a lot of your little sewing tables for girls in the 19th century got turned into nightstands in the 20th century. This is a group of women. I know they're from a church group. I know this is the minister's wife because it's on the back of a postcard, her new baby. And there's the minister, and there's his hat on the quilt frame. And they all posed, I'm sure, after an afternoon of quilting. So they did revive things like quilting parties too, and that has to be, I think, the blue and white quilt. I really don't know. And here's a very nice double 9-patch in red and white on the cover of Needlecraft magazine in the 20s. So this is a Colonial Revival quilt. There is your braided rug. Here's the lady in her colonial dress, which is really, it looks like a 1920s jumper with puff sleeves. And then if you look back here, this is an Art Deco design coming from Europe. And the Colonial Revival was well established through the 1890s and into the 1910s. Then they're going to still be looking at Europe, and Art Deco designs are going to sneak in to the Colonial Revival and soften it. This is a cover of Century magazine for 1915. It's not a quilt, but I just want to show you these little Art Deco flowers that you were seeing all over Europe in the years prior to and right after World War I. Now, mixed in with Art Deco was a whole movement in clothing that began with this performance of the Scheherazade ballet by the Russian ballet troupe in Paris about 1910. And they put on a very erotic, sexy ballet called Scheherazade. It took place in a Middle Eastern harem. And this is Karsnavina, the female, and Nijinsky, a rendering of their costume. It was made out of sheer silk organza, and he just had see-through pants, little slippers, ankle bracelets, a turban. And then Karsnavina, now think of this. This is 1910. Everybody's in a high neck, long sleeves, tight waist, long skirt. And she is in a very low decolletage. It's pinned at her bust. It's open down past her navel. It's sleeveless. Then her legs are covered not by a skirt but by pants that are slit almost to her crotch and beaded. All this is beaded. As they described it, the audience gasped, but no one left the theater. Now, they don't have actual photos inside the theater, because they couldn't do it yet. But this is a shot of Nijinsky and Karsnavina taken outdoors, wearing their costumes, some of them. And you can see that the legs are slit and beaded together. And there's her helmet with the feather, and here's Nijinsky in his pants and his wrap. And there are colored renderings of these two. The first place that people will adopt this kind of new look, very sheer fabrics, is in boudoir, in sexy lingerie. And this will appear about the same time. This is done in France by Lady Duff Gordon, who worked under the couture name Lucille. And you'll begin to see, instead of long white camouflaging nightgowns, you'll begin to see these low necklines and these silky fabrics. And there was a saying in Vogue magazine, while all lingerie is underwear, not all underwear is lingerie. So this now becomes lingerie. And people were shown in Scheherazade scenes. This is a painting that came out after the ballet. You can see in a boudoir, on the kind of cushions that they lounged on during the ballet, in sheer costume, and there's the turban with the feather. And women began to think of their bedrooms as a boudoir, where they could wear this sexy lingerie and recline on cushions as they had in the ballet. And the French couture designer Paul Poiret came out with Scheherazade designs. He took women out of corsets, and you can see sheer chiffon up here at the top, beaded at the bottom, And we've lost the slide at the top, but there's a little helmet with a feather for the hat. And here's a closer look. This is also a poire turban. And you can see how it's coming right out of the Scheherazade ballet with the feather. And you're also beginning to see more prominent makeup that you might admit you had put on. And then this will work its way gradually, first into lingerie, then into evening wear, and then eventually into day wear. But you can see just from this little hat design how it's going to lead into the helmets and then into the cloche hats of the 20s, and how they're decorated with the little Art Deco flowers, and how the necklines are going to V and come out. They're going to give up the high necklines, and eventually they'll have to cut their hair to go under these hats. This is Gloria Swanson. I'm showing you this picture of her in her setting. You're going to see a flower basket here, a boudoir pillow, an electric lamp with a silk shade and fringe. And then she's reclining on her chamois with another pillow. And this is a boudoir doll. And couture designers began to give boudoir dolls to their favorite customers. If you were a good customer, bought a lot of clothes, they would give you this doll, which you could then put in your living room, on your bed, wherever you wanted to. It just said, you know, I just bought expensive clothes from a couture. And Americans really liked these boudoir dolls, and they eventually began to make them, manufacture them here in this country, and you could dress them in the latest couture styles, or you could dress them like colonial ladies. And this is as late as 1930. Here's a little Victorian lady, boudoir doll, reclining like Gloria Swanson on the chamois, surrounded by your boudoir pillows. So French fashion is something American women wanted to follow. This is from the 20s. Here is a woman in her slinking negligee, her boudoir cap. Here's her lamp with the silk shade and the fringe. And here is her lounge with the boudoir pillows. And here is her colonial lady doll. And all of these themes are going to come over into quilt making. There were ads in French magazines and then eventually in magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar for these French boudoir settings. And you'll see beautiful linens trimmed with lace. And right here you see a silk quilt, all quilted. And here's another French-style boudoir room with all the very feminine laces and soft fabrics that you could wear, or you could have in your setting. And one of the first ways you'll see these ideas creeping into America is in advertising. This is a woman in her boudoir with her maid. Most American women didn't have maids, but if you look at magazines from the teens, 20s, and 30s, you'll always see these maids helping people along. So this was kind of a fantasy world. You set up your room like a bazaar, and then you could pretend you were a princess and you had a maid. And then you could pretend you were a princess. And as the magazine said, there wasn't a harried housewife or a tired mother or a stressed out college girl who wouldn't dream of reclining in beautiful clothes in her beautiful boudoir and trying to get a few minutes peace and quiet in her life. And these were pictured in places like Harper's and Vogue. And so you can see American women did start adopting for the boudoir these lingerie fashions with little boudoir caps on lace pillows. And then we'll start to see these silk quilts that were in the ads. This is one of the first ways. And these are like colonial boudoir quilts, that's what I call them. They're silk quilts. This is from McCall's pattern book. So any middle-class lady could have made one of these if she didn't want to purchase them already made. And there's the maid holding up the design. A pretty ribbon arrangement adds much to handsome embroidery. If you didn't want to go completely to silk, this was the in-between stage. This is white cotton with the V-neck and the short sleeves and a cotton boudoir cap. And notice what they've called it from colonial days. So a second way that women used colonial revival strategy. The first way was to make sure that quilts were part of colonial revival. Now they're going to use a colonial revival as a strategy for adopting a very modern fashion piece into their life. And if they can remind their mother, who grew up in the repressive Victorian days, that their colonial grandmother was much more expressive, then maybe they can easily adopt these new styles. This is the era when the Betsy Ross Smith really took off, making the colonial flag. Notice how much her little cap from the 18th century looks like a mop cap, and then like a boudoir cap. And this does not look colonial right here. And here's the cover of Vogue magazine for 1917. A lady in her bed with her silken quilt, her little boudoir cap or mop cap, her little kitty, her 18th century candle stand, and her Art Deco bouquet. See how many things you have to combine? And here are the ads from Vogue and Harper's, showing you how you could recline and the kind of beautiful silk coverlets. And of course, people like the Wilkinson sisters of Indiana and Ann Orr, Eleanor Beard, made up these kind of quilts and sold them to people who did not want to make their own. And here's another ad from the 30s. These lasted well into the 30s. This is a scrapbook that we were given at the University of Akron, and the whole scrapbook is full of designs from Colonial Revival, and she's definitely cut out ideas for these quilts as part of the things she should consider. These are designs from the Wilkinson sisters in Indiana who made a living, pushing this market, and these silk quilts really did look like the whole cloth quilts of the colonial era, only they were usually wool, glazed wool back then instead of silk, but some of them were silk. And the Wilkinson sisters gave them colonial names, Queen Anne, and the Colonial. I'm going to flip back just a minute. This says, this rare conception of ultra artistic merit is well worthy of a queen's boudoir, yet in a palace or bungalow, its beauty radiates the same. So a palace, a bungalow is an arts and crafts house, or a queen's boudoir. They mixed their metaphors. And then here's one called the Princess, because that was another big theme, to pretend you are a princess with a maid when you go into your boudoir. And then they made covers for those little chalons, or the vanity couch was easier for an American to say. So this is a vanity couch cover, a small throw. And they also put French monograms on them. And this was often done on French lingerie, on all the linens for beds and all the nightgowns and dressing gowns. It was very fashionable in the early 20th century to have monograms. During this period of time, Vogue magazine adopted the little Colonial Revival lady as their logo. These are 4 covers that appeared on Vogue magazine in the 19-teens. And they would show the Colonial Revival lady with her low neck and her 3/4 sleeves, little shortened costume like Marie Antoinette may have worn in her little village. And then they would put on the new style. So the low neck of the Colonial is very similar to the low neck or low back of the new French fashions. So why should anyone get upset? It's always been this way in America. We've been able to do this. And then when you look at covers of magazines, this is February 1916, you can see how the evening dresses, this is very low-necked front and back. It's not sleeveless, but the sleeves are covered with lace. And then can't you see how this kind of echoes a colonial open gown? And her hair is pulled back. And here's one also from the late teens, low back, sheer sleeves. So you're getting quite nude, like the Scheherazade ballet. You're soft at your waist, you have your little Art Deco flowers. So those whole cloth silk quilts, boudoir quilts were one way. This is another motif. There are a lot of these out in the cases. These are the colonial lady designs. Now you're dressing like a colonial lady, you can actually embroider a colonial lady. There were no colonial ladies embroidered on any quilts all through the colonial time or the early 19th century. So this is a 20th century invention. I think it often started in the catalogs of companies that sold needlework supplies. They designed bedspreads and accompanying curtains and dressing scarves and vanity scarves and boudoir pillows, and they put out designs that you could do needlework on. Some of them involved applique, and some of them involved embroidery. These are not quilted at this point, but they come out in catalogs in the late teens and 20s. This is the Royal Society. That was Pusilla. This is the Royal Society. This is their tinted organdy Colonial Revival lady set, the bedspread, the bureau cover, the dresser cover, the boudoir pillow. And this is an actual dresser scarf. It's folded, but you can see the little embroidered lady. They also came out with these little kits that you could make colonial ladies for your wall. They're really created from ribbon and lace, and then you had a little paper head that came with the kit, and you framed it. And I think Mary Kay Vogel shared this slide with me. Women then who wanted to quilt looked at these colonial ladies and made their own versions for quilts. And then eventually, of course, women created patterns and sold them to other women, so it became a very popular pattern. They're called parasol ladies, colonial ladies. Now I'm just going to show you a series of slides. So if you would look through magazines and children's storybooks, you'll see these same themes, these ruffled little ladies. This is out of a little girl's sewing book from this period. And you Today we're facing some of the same stresses that our ancestors faced when they first embraced colonial revival. And we like to look back to simpler times. We like to set aside time when we could just sit, think of something beautiful, put the needle in and out, think of what our problems are, how we're going to deal with it. Remember that our mothers and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers got through times like this. That we've lived through things that we may not want to face, but we've made it. So I think maybe colonial revival is kind of a theme that people who live in this country look to. And you don't have to have had colonial ancestors here to adopt this theme and benefit from it. So I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear your comments. Thank you.